Dawn broke in jagged shards of crimson light, as if the sky itself had cracked in response to the devastation below. Most survivors knew the new sun as a threat rather than a source of life. Since the flare rift phenomenon began, every sunset or sunrise could bring about another solar strike, unleashing chaos on patches of land that drastically twisted reality. These warped zones were dreaded by all, but ironically they often contained resources too precious for survivors to ignore. Embers from the most severe flare still burned in the hearts of many, and rumors spread of entirely new forms of matter appearing within these surreal pockets. As he stood on the rusted watchtower, Kalan squinted at the horizon where the warping storm simmered. Stark shadows flickered in the distance, dancing over a warped patch where twisted shapes writhed like ghostly tendrils. He felt the ever-present tension burn through his veins. Rumor had it that these twisted spots appeared randomly, but Colin suspected a pattern. Some whispered that the solar flares only activated in places where the veil between dimensions was already thinning. Others claimed it was a natural evolution of Earth, that the planet was sneezing out pockets of madness in response to the sun's violent belches. He brushed dust off a battered compass, useless in these zones, yet somehow reassuring. The artifact had once belonged to his father, who died during the first big wave of solar flares. Colin's father thought they were just freak solar storms, but quickly realized these anomalies warped the wind, the air, and sometimes even people. Around the border of each warp zone, the environment bent in bizarre ways. Trees took on impossible angles, leaves sang with eerie static hums, and animals were known to vanish in the blink of an eye. Colin's father once told him that the universe was more fragile than people realized, and perhaps these cracks in reality were showing how ephemeral normality could be. Now Colin felt the compass's cool metal in his palm as he contemplated crossing that threshold. His friend Sable walked up the winding stairs of the watchtower, careful to mind the missing steps. She was slim and light-footed, her face streaked with desert grime. In her hand she held a battered rifle, muzzle taped and retaped where it had cracked weeks before. Reaching Colin's vantage point, she laid the weapon against the railing and produced a pair of ragged binoculars. Together they studied the roiling distance where the air shimmered, improbable shapes weaving in tinted mist. Their target lay beyond those swirling illusions, a rumored chasm of resources stable enough to sow water. Plant seeds, perhaps some advanced machinery or data tablets from the old world. Though unverified, the rumor had them itching for a chance. "We confirm the presence of a rift zone." Sable's voice was grim, laced with the same urgency as Colin's thoughts. "The crossing might be lethal," Colin nodded. "But we can't keep the settlement going without new supplies. People are desperate." He looked at Sable, eyes hard with the memory of what had been lost. "I'll do this if you're with me." She tensed her jaw, shoulders straining with readiness and fear. "For the settlement," she said, "and for ourselves. We're too far along to turn back." She handed the binoculars to Colin. He caught the fleeting glint of hope in her eyes. Hope that perhaps the rumor would prove true, that a place existed where they could find resources, untouched by radiation or chaos, maybe even a cure for the strange, creeping sickness that afflicted some who ventured too close to the flares. Colin swallowed, nodded, then slung his pack over his shoulder. They descended the watchtower and walked through a cluster of makeshift huts. Torn sheets and tarps were roped together, forming patchwork shelters in the settlement they called Dust Bowl. A handful of people milled about, many with expressions drained of color. An older man performed rudimentary first aid on a child coughing violently. The dust storms had grown worse since the last flare, and respiratory illnesses thrived in the toxic air. Colin paused for a moment to kneel by the child, letting his presence serve as a silent offering of comfort. He couldn't help but notice the boy's wide, fearful eyes when he looked at Colin's gear. In them, Colin saw the reflection of the settlement's hope, a dire, uncertain reliance on any brave soul willing to cross into those twisted patches. Once they left Dust Bowl's cracked perimeter, they moved quickly but quietly across what remained of a broken highway. Rusted cars jutted out at skewed angles, some melted into lumps of metal from the heat blasts. The land was barren for miles, except for the giant, distorting haze marking the boundary of the warp zone. Colin could smell ozone and something far more unsettling, like metallic blood. The breeze carried faint screams, or perhaps just illusions conjured by the friction of warp energies. He exchanged a glance with Sable. They both steadied themselves, then pushed forward into that mutated land. The first step into the rift was disorienting. Colin's vision swam, as if the area insisted on rewriting the fundamental rules of perspective. The ground rippled underfoot, seeming to shiver. Skyscraper-like shapes flickered at the corner of his eye, only to vanish when he turned his head. He struggled to focus on any single point. Sable pressed a cloth around her mouth, fighting against a wave of nausea. Quietly, they advanced. An hour's travel into the zone, the landscape had changed in ways that defied memory. They passed forests of jagged crystals, shimmering in unnatural light. The bizarre, refracted colors turned the sky into a canvas of swirling blues and pinks. Time felt fluid here, with darkness occasionally creeping in at the corners of Colin's vision, only to reveal the same battered noonday sun overhead. Colin hoped the phenomenon was merely an illusion. He recalled stories of entire scouting parties disappearing within these zones, returning weeks later with blank minds or monstrous mutations, or never returning at all. Sable cleared her throat, voice ragged. "I want to check the map." She fumbled in her pack, withdrawing a printed overlay of satellite imagery from before the flares. Once upon a time, the region had been farmland. Now the topography had shifted drastically. Rivers turned into canyons, and farmland was replaced by these crystalline forests, or melted plains. She pointed to a small mark on the edge of the old farmland. "We aim to reach the silo. The rumor says some water reserves are stored underground there." Colin nodded. "That's our best shot. Let's keep moving." They weaved through bizarre rock formations that seemed to sprout like living sculptures. At times, Colin thought he heard humming, almost like an electrical drone emanating from deep below the earth. Or maybe it was from the crystals themselves. Ever weary, they scanned the horizon for any sign of instability or other travel. Yet the zone seemed empty, as though it swallowed all life. That was until they stumbled upon footprints, or what looked like footprints. The impressions in the ground weren't quite human. Each print had an extra toe, and the spacing between them was erratic. Sable crouched down to trace the odd shape in the dust. "I'm not sure what made these," she whispered, "but it found a path through here." Colin frowned, keeping a hand on the hilt of his machete. The flares have changed more than the air and soil, apparently. He tried to imagine how something with 3 or 4 parted toes could stride so large. Better keep an eye out. They pressed on. Every few minutes, flickers danced at the corner of Colin's vision, as if invisible watchers cloaked themselves in the swirling energies. Worse yet, the land occasionally pulsed with a tremor that threw them off balance. A large distortion wave passed overhead, momentarily turning the atmosphere a deep purple hue and warping the ground so that it appeared to open like a massive jaw. Colin dropped to a crouch, fighting panic. He clenched his father's compass tight, though the direction needle spun wildly. Meanwhile, Sable forced her breath to stay steady, fingertips quivering over the rifle's trigger. They reached the edge of the crystal forest, beyond which lay open desert culminating in a wide, sinkhole-like crater. That, according to their outdated map, was where the farmland silo stood. Despite the illusions, Colin could make out the twisted remnants of a tower protruding from the crater's center. As they descended, a high-pitched buzzing filled their ears. The crater's interior shimmered like molten silver, glinting ominously under the hazy sunlight. "We're close," Colin pointed. "If the rumor's true, the water reservoir might be in that structure." Sable nodded, but her gaze wandered. She sensed something was off. Portions of the crater wall seemed to shift, like shapes crawling just out of sight. Her arms bristled with goosebumps. Colin, too, felt the instinctive prickle that came with looming danger. Without a word, he and Sable took a stealthier approach, making use of rocky outcroppings along the crater's rim. Soon, they saw the figure-8 creature trudging along the crater floor, its body elongated and strangely translucent in patches. Its limbs bent at unsettling angles, and each foot bore an extra digit. The prints matched what they found earlier. They had never encountered anything quite like it, though both had heard stories of the flares mutating animals, or even humans, into horrors. The creatures seemed to be circling the ruined silo, as though guarding or searching. At times it paused to peer into the twisted wreck, then resumed its pacing. Colin felt sweat dribble down his brow, not only from the heat but from raw nerves. "We need to get down there, quietly," he whispered. "Our best chance might be to distract it, or wait until it leaves." Sable's eyes flickered with an edge of terror. She licked her dry lips. "If it's guarding that water reservoir, it might not leave. We should set a distraction and circle around." Her plan was quick and brutal. They would use a flare, ironically gleaned from the old world's stockpiles, to lure the beast away from the silo. The risk was that a real solar flare, unpredictable and far more devastating, might coincide with their small man-made flash, but they had run out of safer strategies. They backtracked a few hundred meters, found a vantage point on the opposite rim of the crater, and carefully tossed the flare into a hollow of rock. It ignited with a sharp fizzle, spitting bright orange sparks. From across the distance, Colin spotted the creature jerk its head in the flare's direction, letting out a chattering hiss that echoed weirdly in the crater's warped acoustic space. Slowly, almost cautiously, it slithered away to investigate. Wasting no time, Colin and Sable descended the rubble slope toward the silo. They had to move quickly, but any misstep could trigger a shift in the environment or alert the creature. Once they reached the rusted metal tower, originally a grain silo, now twisted into a corkscrew by the sun's violent energies, they scanned for an entrance. After climbing over debris, they found a warped hatch partially embedded in the ground. Colin pried it open with a short crowbar. Immediately, air from inside, stale and pungent with mold, rushed into their faces. They dropped into what looked like a storage shaft. Inside the place was a labyrinth of snapped metal beams and curving corridors. Gravity felt strange. At times, Colin swore the angle of the floor was shifting. The overhead ceiling, once trodden by farm workers, now drooped in places with an organic, fleshy quality. The silo must have been ravaged by repeated surges of chaotic energy. Small flickers of greenish luminescence glowed from cracks in the walls. Moving carefully, they navigated deeper until they found a series of compartments. Once, these chambers would have held grain or farm supplies. Now, they were partially flooded with murky liquid that smelled faintly of rot. However, Colin noticed a few areas where water seemed clearer. They found a container that tested the small portable purifier they carried, verifying the quality. To their cautious joy, the purifier indicated that some of this water was near potable. They filled their canteens and reserves with as much as they could carry. A subdued, momentary relief suffused them. Water was critical. They took a few precious sips, feeling refreshing coolness in their parched throats. The taste was still a bit off, tinged with a metallic note, but it would sustain Dust Bowl for some time if they could bring enough back. Sable stared at the canister with something like reverence, but there was more to discover here. Further in, they located a sealed side room that might contain other relics from before. They forced it open. They found shelves with battered packets of seeds, though most had liquefied from exposure. Documents, maybe technical blueprints, lay scattered, the ink smudged. Colin carefully pulled an old lockbox from a corner. Inside, he discovered several small vials labeled with scientific notations. He couldn't decipher them fully, but the word antidote jumped out in bold black letters. Sable felt her heart race. If true, it could be a cure, or at least a partial remedy for the solar sickness ravaging many survivors. Their victory was short-lived. A deep rumble reverberated through the silo's foundations. Colin nearly lost his footing as the entire corridor lurched, walls flexing as if breathing. Then came the distant chattering hiss. The creature was back. Perhaps it had traced their footsteps, or ignored the flare altogether, returning to guard its territory. Colin motioned for silence, but a second quake rattled the structure. They realized it wasn't just the creature. Something bigger was happening. A solar flare might be striking again, or the warp energies were spiking for some other reason. They pressed themselves against the wall, hearts pounding. "We should head back," Sable whispered urgently. "This place could collapse at any moment." But the next hallway twisted abruptly, leaving them disoriented. The layout seemed to change each time the silo trembled. Doors disappeared or reappeared in different locations, making it nearly impossible to retrace their steps. Trails of luminescent fungus lined the walls, and occasionally the spool of hallway flickered like a mirage. They heard a scraping sound. In a flash, the mutated guardian lunged into the corridor, screeching an alien war cry. Sable raised her rifle and fired a shot. The bullet grazed the thing's side. A spray of blackish fluid splattered the metal walls. Its elongated jaws snapped, and it scrambled forward unnervingly fast. Colin grabbed a piece of twisted pipe from the ground, swinging it in desperation. The mutated creature hissed, flinched backward, then lunged again with renewed frenzy. The hallway warped under the creature's weight, metallic surfaces bent. Sable shouted in panic as the floor lurched, sending them sliding toward the thrashing horror. Colin angled the pipe wide, picking the creature's front limb and attempting to wrestle it off balance. It shrieked, spittle flying from its needle-like teeth. Sable seized the chance to fire another round, striking it squarely in what might have been a vital area. It collapsed with a sickening thud, spasming violently. Then, with a final chattering moan, it went still. Colin and Sable panted, adrenaline pounding in their ears. But there was no time to rest. The corridor around them pitched like a ship in a storm. Sable grabbed Colin's arm, bracing him before they fell into some swirling pocket of warped space. Then a deep crack split the metal walls, revealing a jagged, spiral path to the surface. The blazing red glare of the sun peered through the gap. Distortion waves shimmered all around, and a swirl of dust poured in. They scrambled toward that opening, hauling their precious canisters of water and the box of mysterious vials. Over twisted beams, through spiraling corridors they clambered up until they emerged onto the crater floor. The ground there was shifting, lumps of earth rising and falling like molten lava. Sable nearly stumbled into a hole that spontaneously opened and closed. Colin pulled her back. Sparks of solar-induced energy flashed overhead, painting the sky with ephemeral shapes that resembled living constellations. It was as if the entire zone was unraveling under the cosmic onslaught. Staying meant death. Lumbering forward with determined steps, they fought the unsteady terrain. Buckets of dust whipped around them. Each new quake threatened to swallow them, but they clung to the hope that once they left this cursed region, they might find normal ground. At the crater's edge, Colin paused to check for any sign of the mutated creature's kin or other threats. All he saw was swirling dust and random illusions flickering. With renewed urgency, they scaled the crater's rim and reached the comparatively stable side. The path to Dust Bowl was still leagues away, but at least the ground there didn't actively try to consume them. Yet. They journeyed for hours, the mania of the rift slowly receding behind them. The environment along the border seemed raw, as if perpetually teetering on the edge of collapse. Eventually they crossed that invisible line marking the normal wasteland, desolate and hot, but at least free from the swirling madness. By the time they neared Dust Bowl's perimeter, the sun hovered low on the horizon, golden red rays sliding across the desert floor. The settlement's sentries spotted Colin and Sable's dusty silhouettes. Immediately, townsfolk rushed out, seeing their battered forms carrying bulging canisters and battered crates. They guided the pair to the communal shade tent. As soon as Colin and Sable lowered their burdens, others reached for the water with trembling hands. Elders insisted on rationing, but the excitement was palpable. Sable collapsed onto a crate, cradling her rifle. Colin, on his knees, stared at the chaotic swirl in the distance, and allowed a wave of relief to crash over him. A tired hush fell upon the settlement as they recognized the risk Colin and Sable had taken. Quietly, the pair recounted the mutated guardian, the twisting corridors, and the near collapse of that silo. Then Colin produced the lockbox. Carefully, he opened it, showing them the small vials. A hush fell as he read the partial labels scrawled in faded black letters. An antidote. It might only be partial or experimental, but it was something. He could see in the elders' eyes how desperately they yearned for a cure to the solar sickness that was stealing breath and life from the youngest and oldest among them. Evening deepened. Fires were lit around the settlement, creating flickering pockets of warmth against the growing chill. The emptiness of the wasteland enveloped them, but at Dust Bowl's heart, a muted sense of hope glimmered. Sable shared a meager meal with Colin, sipping from a battered mug of the newly purified water. She watched the swirling red horizon and spoke softly. "We barely made it out. The warping is worse now. That entire zone might collapse or expand. We don't know." Colin nodded, remembering his father's warnings. "The planet changes before our eyes. Maybe it will only get worse. But if those seeds we found are viable, and if this antidote proves real," his voice caught, a surge of raw emotion welling in his chest. "They might finally have a fighting chance. Not an end to all suffering, but a foothold to cling to in this battered world." Darkness settled fully, and the settlement bunkered down for the night. Colin found a quiet corner near the watchtower ruins to rest. He gazed up at the stars. Since the flares had begun, some stars seemed brighter, or perhaps the thinning atmosphere revealed more cosmic lights. One or two flickered as though winking out. He wondered what tomorrow would bring. Another cataclysmic distortion? Or a rare reprieve in which Dust Bowl's residents could begin planting seeds and testing the antidote? Sable approached quietly, dropping onto the dusty ground beside him. They sat without speaking for a while, the desert hush broken only by the crackling of distant campfires and the tender breathing of those who tried to sleep. Finally, Sable spoke, her voice low but resolute. "We're not done, are we? If those vials work, if more supplies are hidden in other zones, we'll have to go back." Colin let out a slight, dry laugh. "Final day soon, yes. We'll need to face the warp zones again. Until we can stand on stable ground beyond their influence, we don't have a choice." He paused, turning his father's compass over in his hands. "My father believed something big was unfolding, far bigger than just survival, and we might be forging a path forward, not only for us, but for everyone that's left." Sable nodded, leaning her head back to stare at the swirling cosmos. Somewhere far beyond Earth's battered skies, that raging sun continued spitting flares. She closed her eyes, recalling flashes of the warp zone's twisting crystals and living corridors. Despite the horrors, it felt as though the zone itself was a living puzzle, a place where one might glimpse the universe's hidden corners. She wondered if they had only barely scratched the surface of that phenomenon. If behind that monstrous face of chaos, some new potential for life might be waiting. They wouldn't get answers tonight. Sleep beckoned. Tomorrow would be filled with distributing water, analyzing the seeds, and hopefully making sure that the settlement's children lived another day. Reality might warp, but hope could bend right alongside it, refusing to snap. Some part of Colin thrilled at the idea that, for the first time in ages, they possessed seeds literal and metaphorical that could blossom into a future. When the sun rose again, painting the dust with pale orange, Colin and Sable stirred. They joined the settlement clans in carefully administering small doses from the vials to the sick, with the town's elderly medic overseeing. The battered purifier processed more of the silo water, ensuring that fresh water trickled into the parched mouths of townfolk who had nearly given up. There were tears of relief, of fear, of half-buried optimism on many a face. This was a victory, albeit a small one. But in the midst of a land ravaged by cosmic upheaval, a single drop of hope could be enough to keep a community alive. Far off across the wastes, a faint shimmer marked the warp zone's boundary. Another crack of thunderous energy rumbled, though if it was an actual solar storm or simply the memory of one, Colin couldn't tell. He closed his eyes, inhaled the dusty air, and pressed the spinning compass close to his chest. From here on, the world would never be the same. Yet for the first time in years, he felt as though the path forward, however warped and dangerous, was navigable. Even if reality itself twisted in unpredictable shapes, they now had a reason to traverse those violent thresholds, a reason to fight for a life beyond dust and despair. They would rest, regroup, and return to those corrupted lands, because among that chaotic swirl of illusions and cosmic madness, there might be the keys to rebuilding, enough water and seeds to revive a dead world, or even a cure for the disease spawned by the sun's wrath. They had crossed that threshold once and lived. Someday soon they would do it again. For now, Colin and Sable walked together, letting the final hush of morning greet them. The settlement, battered but unbroken, stood behind them. Ahead lay the uncertain horizon, painted with the promise of another day's savage sunlight. In Colin's mind, a single thought glowed. The warped zone had nearly devoured them, but they emerged with a flicker of redemption. If that didn't prove that hope could endure beyond any twisted boundary, nothing would. And so they pressed on with renewed hearts, determined to face the next shift in reality, wherever, whenever it would come.